Folks, welcome to Set Apart Homestead, the prepared homestead. So I've been talking a lot about things that could happen, things that are kind of on the horizon. That's a possibility, and I don't want to come across as being another Chicken Little Skies Falling, big hype trying to terrify everyone. That's not really my point. And I kind of explained that in the last video. But I think it's some things that we need to be aware of and take notice of that are just going on around us. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, well, there's other reasons that we prepare. There's other reasons that we want to live self-sufficient. There's other reasons to homestead than just because there's a potential civil war or famine or something like that. And one of those I was thinking is just, and I kind of briefly touched on this in the last video, is that our system is so much more fragile than most people think. Take for instance the infrastructure for our utilities, predominantly electric. We're already seeing, most of us experience outages on occasion, storms, ice storms, thunderstorms, things like that will knock the power out for a while. But there are certain places, namely California, that over the last few years have dealt with a numerous brownouts and blackouts, and some of these blackouts have lasted for quite a bit of time, several days. And you could go into maybe some political reasons of why that's happening, but one of the reasons, a big reason, is that the infrastructure is just not capable of handling the load that's on it. And that is true everywhere. And it's something that I've always talked about with people when it comes to things that should make you want to be a little bit more prepared, is that the infrastructure that we have is grossly overburdened, and it's antiquated. Most of the even though we have all this really high-tech, high-speed internet, Wi-Fi, microchip, microprocessors, all this kind of stuff, when it comes to the electrical grid, the things that control it, the stations that control it, many of them are still operating under the equipment that was installed back in the 1950s. It's very common for a lot of these stations and these plants and stuff that the equipment that controls them is 50, 60, 70 years old. And you could use the argument, well, it was because the stuff was made good quality back then, and that's true. I'm sure the quality of the equipment is quite well, but it's not going to last forever. And it was also designed for a lot less load than what we're experiencing now. About 70% of all the power lines in the United States are at least 25 years old, and some of them twice that age. Excuse me, been dealing with a little bit of cold cough kind of thing going on. So pardon the raspiness in my voice. But the grid that we have is just it's weak, and much like I've mentioned before, that there's this illusion that it's secure, and the reason is because you go in and you flip the light switch and you have the lights come on, but the odds and the possibility that system could fail are actually much higher than you would think. And then you have to add to that the way the grid is set up, that if you know what you're doing, and it wouldn't take, say, a terrorist very much research and to find out how to do this, there are certain junctions throughout the grid that if you hit that one place and shut it down, it'll cause a cascading effect, and huge regions of the electrical grid will come crashing down. And this is something that even the government has talked about in the past, of trying to come up with a plan to correct that, to fix it. The problem is the grid is so large that we're near the point of it being an impossibility to actually go in and start replacing that. Like it's so massive. There's so many people on it, and there's so much power consumption. So it's not something that they can just go in and replace. Another factor, since 2010, there's been about 250 coal-fired power plants shut down in the United States, and there's been several nuclear ones, and there are more slated to be shut down. And the reason is because there's this push to switch over to renewable energy, solar and wind power. And I'm not opposed to solar and wind power, especially solar. I think it's a pretty good option. The fact is making that available for an entire grid is a lot. It's a lot of work, a lot of money, and we're not replacing with solar fast enough. And so what's happening is the existing power plants are being overtaxed because they're shutting down these other ones, because we're trying to get away from coal, because the environmentalists are losing their mind because of coal-fired power plants, and so the push is to replace it with renewable energy sources, and the problem is they're not replacing them fast enough. So there's been an increased tax on the remaining power plants, so that weakens the system. So we have to, when we're looking at the reasons why we do what we do, those of you watching, what is it that you do what you do? It's not always some grand, catastrophic, apocalyptic Armageddon. And I've talked about this many times. I know sometimes for some of you, and also, I'll admit, I'm kind of this way, there's an excitement, kind of a, fun aspect to it, of planning and thinking about what to do in some type of, apocalyptic doomsday, post-apocalyptic doomsday Armageddon. As bad as that would be, there is a little bit of excitement there to, think about how you would survive, how you would pull through. And there's a possibility that we might experience that. But there's a much higher possibility that we could experience, parts of the grid shutting down for a few weeks at a time. There's a much higher possibility that we could deal with a nuclear power plant melting down in your area. There's a much higher possibility that we could deal with the water system, shutting down or becoming contaminated. The sewage processing systems, all of those are just as fragile as the electric system. The water system, I've talked about that before. That, of course, some of you probably have well water, and so I guess you're not part of this, although it can affect you if the water, the public water systems start failing, especially the sewage treatment systems. What can very easily happen is those sewage treatment systems, the safeties on them, if they're controlled electronically, they can fail, and that sewage water can then start leaking back into the main water. It can run into lakes and rivers and streams and stuff like that, and eventually get into groundwater, and then it can affect your well. And the real danger isn't, the public water systems, treatment systems for like residential systems, those are dangerous. The sewage that comes out of the residence is dangerous, but what's really dangerous is the industrial waste. When you add in the industrial waste, if that kind of stuff, those systems fail, and that industrial waste gets into our water system, gets into our groundwater, that's some pretty nasty junk. And so all of these things are dependent upon electricity working, upon the equipment that's functioning, and the manpower functioning, and no one messing with it. And the reality is that that would not take very much for those systems to start to fail. And like I said, what happens, or what can happen, and it has happened in the past, is that when they start failing in an area, it can cause a domino effect, and other systems within the region become then overtaxed, and then they fail, and that's why you have these widespread blackouts. Um, this is the kind of thing that you should be preparing for. You should be planning for. Do you have a generator? Do you have solar panels? And if you don't have those things, then what are your plans as if your home is without power for any length of time? Your food, in refrigerators and freezers will start spoiling. Um, if you have a well, you may not be able to pump that. Do you have a way to get that water out of the well? And I hear so many people, and I've been on well water for many years now, and they're like, yeah, well, I have my own well, and that's great, but what are you going to do about getting that water out of that well? And a lot of these wells are very deep, and it takes quite a bit to pump them out. And a lot of these small generators can't handle it. They can't handle the pull that some of these deep wells, the pumps pull on, and the small generators just can't handle them. Because a lot of these wells, you're talking 300 and 400 foot, or maybe even deeper in some cases. So you're not going to go hook up the old red cast iron hand pump that you would see in the old westerns and stuff. That kind of stuff is not going to pump. Those kind of pumps, old hand pumps, aren't going to pump from 300 foot below. They do make hand pumps that will pump that from that deep, but they're quite pricey. And if you're able to afford them, I would suggest looking into them for your homestead. I have looked into them myself, and I would like to at some point get one, because you can set them up that you can still run on your regular well pump, but have that hand pump set up as a backup. But like I said, they're not cheap. They're several $1,000s. But it is a way to pull that water up out of the ground. If you're anywhere near industrial waste, and sewage treatment plants and stuff like that, especially if you're downstream from them, even if you have a well, I would not guarantee that it's going to be safe, because if there's a failure upstream from you, uphill from you, that will seep into the water, and it eventually will get down to you. And there are charts that you can look at. Usually your Department of Natural Resources can help you, and they can, if you look online, I've looked, and you can find this kind of information, and you can get a pretty good idea of how long it takes water to flow from this area to your area. And that can give you an idea, if you're 100 miles south of a big industrial waste treatment area, and it fails and it all dumps into the ground and the groundwater, how long is it going to take that to reach your well? And when you're dealing with industrial waste and these chemicals, you can't guarantee that the ground is going to clean them as well as it would just your normal bacteria that's found in nature. Because these chemicals, they have an almost indefinite lifespan. And it's been shown that, a lot of your more natural filters, meaning the ground, they don't filter them. So they contaminate them. So, if you live downstream of these places, you need to kind of start looking at, okay, how long is it going to take that to travel to my place? And it may or may not, but it's definitely something to be planning for. And then how do you get that water up out of the ground? And then once you get it up out of the ground, do you have a way to filter it? Do you have a way to purify that? Do you have a way to run power to your home and to figure out what's the bare necessities that you need? A lot of these solar systems, you see, $30,000, $40,000, and I guess if you've got that kind of money to drop into one, that's fine. But the reality is you don't need to run as much stuff as these large systems are capable of running. I mean, they're capable of taking a moderate sized home and running them just like you would if you were on the grid. you can downsize that substantially and run a small home with very limited electrical use. But if you do it right, on a very small system that would cost much, much less than those big systems. And there's, with the new light bulbs, the LED light bulbs, those help a lot because they use a lot less electricity. There's refrigerators, there's all kinds of things on the market now that use a much smaller amount of electrical load than what used to. So there are ways to do it, and there's ways to do it on a much smaller budget, because I think a lot of us, that's what we deal with. We're aware of these things. We know about them, we think them through, and we realize that we've got to be prepared because there's a chance that we may have to go through that. But then the thing is well, how can we afford the cost to be prepared? And so you have to learn ways to do it, and not pay the ridiculous amounts of money. I knew a guy years ago I lived down the road from, and he was aware of things and knew that we had to be prepared, but he was the type that really didn't dig and learn on how to do it. He would just pay someone else to do it. And it wasn't that he was a really wealthy man or anything, but he wanted to have solar power so that he could run his house and not have to worry if something happened, he could still have electricity. So anyways, contacted a solar company. They came out and they put in a $40,000 solar system in his house. It was nice. The thing is it would only run if there was electric running to through the power grid. As soon as the power went off, he didn't realize that you have to pay a few $1,000s more to get the controller that will switch his home over to solar if the power grid goes off. So the sad thing is that he has this $40,000 solar system, and once it was installed, it was pretty much worthless. All he was doing was selling his electricity back to the power company. But if the power went off, he still had no power. In fact, I remember once the power did go off, and here he is with the little generator trying to run things in his house. And I walked down there and I laughed. I said, I'm sorry, but here you've got a $40,000 solar system hooked up to your house, and you still got to run your refrigerator on a little dinky generator. And so a lot of times it's not how much money you spend to be prepared, it's how much you think things through and how much research you do and learn, and don't just take it with some salesman that tries to sell you something, or some company that tells you it's the newest, greatest, latest thing that's gonna protect you and help you survive. Sometimes the old ways are the better ways, and there are ways to do it that don't cost as much as you would think. But realizing that a lot of times what we should be preparing for are maybe not the most glamorous and exciting things, but they are probably the most probable things that we'll face. And so the likelihood that some of the people watching this video right now in the next 12 months will experience a grid failure in their area that'll last more than 2 or 3 days is actually quite high probability. And 2 or 3 days off the grid, you're talking things in your, refrigerator's gonna start spoiling. How are you gonna bathe? How are you gonna flush the toilet? Where are you gonna get your drinking water if there's no water with that failure? And then is the water contaminated? All these things that we have to think about. And while that may not be an apocalyptic situation, it's still an SHTF in your life if you're having to go through it. Several years ago, I went through a big ice storm, and my house was without power for 14 days. And I was already a prepper before then, but that was the first time I really had a personal reality of what it would be like to live without it. And that was when I started making a lot more changes in my lifestyle to really get more prepared. But going that long without the power grid is a big deal, and it can happen, and it's very likely that many of you will experience that in the near future. So don't always just focus on prepping for the glamorous and the really cool video game like apocalypse. sometimes just prepping for the things that's just gonna happen are what we really need to be doing. And I think that gets missed a whole lot just because it doesn't seem as cool. All right, you know, do this kind of stuff with your family. It's very important to get them on board. And I understand not everyone wants to be on board. So you may have a spouse that thinks this is ridiculous, or your kids just don't care. You know, sometimes you have to be gentle and talking to them and try to show them little things and try to get them encouraged and show them what's going on, because, you know, if you've got a family and you're just doing this on your own, it's not going to work like you think it will. And then if something happens, it's going to be a struggle to get them to participate and follow the plan. So, you know, start now of getting your family ready, talking to them, and realizing that, you know, not everything is, you know, the zombie apocalypse. Sometimes it's just, you know, the power's out for the next 7 or 8 days. And that's going to be a big deal too. So, all right. Well, thank you all for watching. And I will catch you in the next video.